Hello, and welcome to our viewers in Europe and in the United States, and particularly those who are part of the World Affairs Council's network. The American Council on Germany is happy to partner with the Tennessee World Affairs Council to host today's discussion. I'm Steve Sokol, and I'm the president of the American Council on Germany, and I'm honored to lead today's conversation. I am particularly delighted to welcome back Dr. Liana Fix and General Ben Hodges. Liana Fix is a fellow for Europe at the Council on Foreign Relations and is based in Washington, D.C. Previously, she served as the International Affairs Department at the Körber Foundation in Berlin. Liana, herzlich willkommen.
Dankeschön. Thank you.
And Ben Hodges served as Commanding General of the U.S. Army in Europe prior to his retirement in early 2018. Since then, he's been involved with several nonprofit organizations and think tanks, and he's currently a senior advisor to Human Rights First. Ben, it's great to see you again. Thanks for joining us.
I'm very happy to have the opportunity, the privilege, and also to work alongside the legendary Dr. Liana Fix.
Well,
thank you.
It's a real treat to have both of you with us again. We've been able to host webinars with each of you throughout this period of the renewed conflict in Ukraine, but we've not had a chance to bring the two of you together in this format. So it's great to see you both, and I'm very much looking forward to our conversation, even though it's not really an easy or enjoyable conversation to have. Ben, I'd like to start with you to get sort of your assessment of the current status of the war. Of course, over the weekend, the Kerch Bridge, which connects Russian-occupied Crimean Peninsula to Russia, was attacked. The Ukrainians had been bracing for the possibility of some retaliatory attacks following the attack on the bridge, which basically hindered Russia's ability to send troops and supplies to the south. And today it's been widely reported that Russia retaliated with dozens of missile strikes on Kiev and elsewhere in Ukraine. So can you sort of give us your take on where we are with the conflict right now and sort of where things stand?
Well, it certainly has been a busy last few days with so many new things happening, from the sham referenda to the illegal annexations and then the rapid success by Ukrainian forces, the attack on the bridge, the missile strikes, a lot happening in a condensed period of time. So let me put it in a context first, and then maybe talk about a couple of them specifically. Ukraine has achieved irreversible momentum. In my mind, there's no doubt. There's no going back for this momentum that Ukraine is moving forward. It's too early to plan victory parades, obviously, but the momentum feels irreversible. And more people that I speak with from different countries, different agencies, I think are sharing a sense of this irreversible momentum. So because of that, and because of the challenges that Russian Federation forces have been having, I mean, their ground forces are clearly on the back foot. They have manpower problems. So this partial mobilization, which was a incoherent rollout and terribly executed thus far, and of course put 500,000 Russian military-age males on the road out of Russia, has revealed a lot about the will of Russia to do they really want to fight. And we know from history that war is a test of will as well as a test of logistics. And so what I'm seeing now is Russia trying to do everything it can to change the dynamic, to change that momentum, to distract, disrupt, and mostly prolong the conflict to break our will. Because key to Ukrainian victory is going to be continued support from the West. led by the United States, Germany, UK, continued support for Ukraine in terms of delivering what we said we would do, but also keeping the sanctions in place. These sanctions are having a real effect. The precision munitions that we saw flying into Ukrainian cities this morning, they cannot be replaced because of sanctions. The Russians do not have the ability to replenish their weapons that they're using against Ukrainian civilians. So I think they're trying to draw it out in hopes that we will lose the will to continue support because of our own energy prices, because of concerns and anxiety about our own our infrastructure. That's what I think. I think this is where we are, and we have to keep in mind what Gary Kasparov said in his interview with DeVelt just a couple of weeks ago. He said, "This is the last winter. This is the last winter that Russia can damage or disrupt Europe. They won't have that same influence after this. So we've got to stick with Ukraine."
Thank you, Ben. I mean, I think that's a great way of sort of setting the stage and providing for a good jumping off point. Liana, do you share Ben's assessment that Ukraine has gained irreversible momentum and that Russia is really trying to prolong the conflict? Part of the reason why I'm asking that is, I think in one of our earlier webinars, we talked about the fact that it seemed like both Russia and Ukraine were trying to prolong the conflict for sort of different reasons, different motivations.
I share Ben's assessment, but let me add perhaps two thoughts. I think Russia tries to prolong and to stabilize the front in eastern Ukraine with the mobilization. But what we've seen now with the attacks on Ukrainian cities is basically the beginning of Russia's defeat, because it is a reaction to domestic pressure that Vladimir Putin has encountered. It is perhaps less of an immediate reaction to the Kerch Bridge attack. Ukrainian forces have said that those attacks were planned before. They also said they knew about those attacks, and it's remarkable that Ukrainian forces have been able to prevent about half of the missiles from actually finding their target. This is an astonishing number, and it demonstrates, despite the tragedy and how terrible these attacks are, that Ukraine can defend itself, and obviously it needs more support on air defense there. Also, this next stage that we see here now, sort of these renewed attacks on the whole of Ukraine, not only in the eastern part, is as tragic as it is an expected next step, because Putin is running out of other options. So what he tries to do now, given that mobilization has not worked, that he's not able to stabilize the front in the east, what he's trying to do now is sort of waging a campaign of terror against Ukraine and also against the West, attacking Western infrastructure. So this is sort of a widening of the conflict and an escalation, which is because of Russia's weakness and because of its failures. In return, it will harden the resolve of the West. I don't think that it will put fear into the West and into Europe. And it might calm Putin's domestic critics for a while, who welcome these attacks as a revenge act against Ukraine. But it will not turn the tide in the conventional war. So it will calm those critics only for a short time, whereas in the medium and long term, Vladimir Putin may come again under significant pressure from nationalists, from right-wing hardliners in Russia, who have criticized his failures in the last week.
Thank you. I'd like to maybe pick up on a couple of points that each of you have raised. Liana, you were talking about the fact that Ukraine's air defenses have been pretty strong and have been able to sort of take out about half of the missiles that were directed toward Ukraine. In a couple of the reports that I was reading, I saw that more than 80 missiles were sent by Russia into Ukraine, that the Russians were also using Iranian drones. Ben, how would you assess Ukraine's air defenses up to now, but also moving forward, if we can expect more attacks like this coming up. You're muted at the moment.
You would think after 2 years of living in Zoom land, I would be better trained. I think the Ukrainians have made it very clear that their top priority request is for air and missile defense, and today's missile attacks just illustrates that. This is about protecting European citizens, European civilians, not air bases or seaports or that sort of thing. It's protecting innocent Ukrainian, European civilians. So we've got to figure out what to do. Now, the whole time I was a commander of U.S. Army Europe, I was sweating our lack of air and missile defense. We have one Patriot battalion for all of Europe. That's it. And so there's not enough. It's not like there are systems sitting around somewhere in Europe. And of course, nations along Russia's, or nations along the Eastern Front, if you will, are going to be reluctant to give up air and missile defense systems because they're worried about being targeted themselves. So we've got to figure out how can we get capability to Ukraine as quickly as possible. And I think it would really be powerful if the president and the Bundeskanzler and others were to come out today and say, okay, we see what's happening here. Priority one is we're handing over certain capabilities as fast as we can. And I have to tell you, I don't want to hear this, well, it'll take so long to train them how to use Patriot. Well, start now. Well, you should have started months ago, just to help Ukraine train on systems that are out there. I have been impressed with how well Ukrainian air defenders have done to shoot down exactly as Liana said, you know, how many they knocked down. They've also been effective with decoys, having Russians launch missiles at wooden structures, thinking they were hitting some other real target. But at the end of the day, it's math, and you know how many get through.
Mm-hmm. No, I think that's a good way of thinking about it. Liana, you also, or both of you, I mean, we've talked a little bit about the attack on the bridge, and Liana, I'm curious how legitimate you think Vladimir Putin's description of that attack is as a terrorist attack. One of our viewers is also curious whether or not we know whether the Ukrainians were responsible for the attack on the bridge. It's something that they've denied some responsibility for, but sort of what's the general consensus in the West of who carried out that attack on the bridge?
Well, there's a little bit sort of fog in there, but I do think it is likely that Ukraine has carried out these attacks. It has announced in the past the Kerch Bridge will be a target, and it's not only a civilian target, it's a significant military target because it was one of the main supply lines of Russian forces in Crimea and in the south. So what we've seen with these attacks on the bridge, but also with other attacks on logistical hubs in eastern Ukraine, is that those attacks were meant to sort of help Ukraine's offensive in the West and to disrupt Russian infrastructure, which is also heavily reliant on rail. And the Kerch Bridge, again, I would not classify it as a terrorist attack. It is a military structure that has been used intensively by the Russian side for the preparation and for the conduct of this war. Mm-hmm. Now, the other question is, to what extent is the attack on the Kerch Bridge and also the attacks in Crimea, to what extent is this part of those mysterious red lines of the Russian president that we are discussing so often? And what we've seen in the past now is that the attacks on Crimea, but also the attack on the Kerch Bridge, has not led to, obviously, an immediate Russian nuclear response, as Putin's nuclear threats might have suggested before. And it is a little bit sort of a Ukrainian attempt to reduce the fear that we have of these Russian red lines, in the same way as Vladimir Putin tried to draw a red line around those attempted annexation territories. The aim of the Ukrainian side is to show to the world and to their partners, look, these wet lines are not wet lines. These wet lines can be watered down. And these wet lines do have military value for our campaign. Obviously, again, the bridge was of importance and is of importance to Vladimir Putin, but the assumption that anything related to Crimea, any attacks related to Crimea, will cross the threshold of Russia's nuclear response has not been confirmed.
I'd like to maybe get to the nuclear question a little bit later in our conversation, but I want to stick with this notion of red lines for a moment. I'd be interested in hearing from each of you, maybe starting with Ben and then Liana, whether you think that what we're seeing right now with the Kerch bridge attack, with the retaliatory attacks using missiles, does this sort of mark a new chapter in the war as far as you're concerned, or is it a sort of logical progression that we could have anticipated?
Well, I think, as Liana said, the Ukrainians were anticipating something like this, and I'm not sure I would call these missile strikes retaliatory. I mean, to launch that many missiles to hit targets in 10 or 12 different cities simultaneously, that's not something you wake up in the morning and pull and say, hey, I want to. I imagine that this has probably been in the works for a while. I don't know what the timing was or anything, but I actually think this is part of a larger context of an attempt by Russia to conduct another Holodomor, the starvation of Ukraine, because what they're doing is hitting power grids, food storage, food production facilities, and trying to make the cities uninhabitable. So that as winter approaches, Ukraine is beset with food problems, heating problems, housing problems, infrastructure problems. So whether this is a new phase or it's desperation, it's clear that the Russians still intend to destroy Ukraine as a state and the idea of Ukraine as a state. And so they're just going all out, launching drones and missiles from Russia, and also, by the way, from Belarus against civilian targets, with the intention of creating the conditions for the Holodomor and the Kolodomor, which is to freeze to death. I spoke with a Ukrainian Rada member earlier today. That was their assessment, and so I think we got to think about these as more than just retaliation or Putin being embarrassed and striking back. I think it's more than that.
Maybe as a quick follow-up before Liana comes back in, Ben, any thoughts on the new Russian commander in the war in Ukraine, Sergei Surovikin? Do you think that he, is playing any role in this new direction in this planning?
I don't know how much he's been able to do so far, but the one adjective that keeps coming up every time you read about him here in the last couple of days is brutal, and so that seems to be his principal quality for which he was selected to be the overall commander. Now, what difference will this make in the near term? I don't know. The problems that the Russian forces have demonstrated over the last 7 months are so deep-rooted that a new commander is not going to fix any of that anytime soon. Their broken, exhausted logistics system, their inability or perhaps cultural unwillingness to conduct what we would call joint operations, where you integrate the air, land, and maritime forces and special forces. They haven't done any joint thing for 7 months. I don't think he's going to be any better at that. And the effects of the corruption over years that have been on display. A new commander is not going to fix that. So we'll see what happens, but he will certainly not be bashful about continuing launching missiles into residential areas.
Yeah, yeah. Liana, what would you like to add to that?
I mean, I would say you asked, Stephen, whether this is a new chapter of the war. I would argue that the new chapter of the war has started with Russia's mobilization and the attempted annexation of the territories, because it has demonstrated that Russia, and especially Vladimir Putin, is going for escalation in this war. And escalation includes attacks on Ukrainian civilian infrastructure, on energy infrastructure, but again, also attacks against the broader West and infrastructure in the West. So I would place sort of the beginning of the new chapter a bit earlier. The question is, what does it mean for us that we are in this new chapter where Vladimir Putin is going for escalation? The first thing that it means is that our preferred outcome of this war, pushing Russia back to the pre-February 24, to the pre-invasion lines, and hoping that this might lead to a Russian willingness to negotiate, is something which is over. We will not have negotiations after Russia's attempted annexation after mobilization. So the question is, what else is the end game if it becomes increasingly unlikely that just pushing Russia back conventionally will lead to a willingness from the Russian side to negotiate? And this is sort of the next the question that you will have to answer in the next weeks and months. How can this war end if we see so far no willingness from the Russian side whatsoever to accept defeat?
So, you know, on that path to defeat, if you will, I mean, it seems as if Russia is certainly continuing to throw a lot of resources at the conflict. The defense ministry recently said it has 200,000 new recruits. I think we have yet to see sort of the impact of those new recruits on the battlefield. On the contrary, on the battlefield, we're seeing Ukraine's army getting more and more momentum and having victories. Ben, you were talking a little bit about some of the deep-rooted problems on the Russian side. Is Russia's problem a lack of soldiers? Or, as one of our viewers asks, how did Putin get so far behind in the funding and modernization of the Russian army?
Well, they're not behind in the funding and modernization. It was wasted. I mean, they spent a ton of money. New airplanes, modern, new equipment. I mean, they have spent since 2007 a lot of money. But you know, spending money on new kit does not equal a better force. Having a lot of ships does not equal having a good Navy. What they have failed to do is build what we would call build readiness. Units that are capable, ready to fight, that they're properly and fully manned. They have maintenance, support, logistics, soldiers, pilots, ships, crews know how to do their job. And what we have seen is, other than the artillerymen who seem to be pretty good, nobody is actually very good at their job. When we all watched the sinking of the Moskva, you know, back in the around April timeframe, and I talked to a Navy friend of mine. I said, "What do you think about that?" He said, "Well, clearly this is a ship where they did not have the culture that you would find on a U.S. Navy ship or the German Marine or in the Royal Navy, where the priority for everybody is to save the ship, and then you save your shipmate, and then you save yourself." That Russian crew, they got off the thing as fast as they could. And it probably would have been saved with basic readiness, firefighting, plus the radar on that ship is like 1980s technology. This is the flagship of the Black Sea Fleet. You know, and today the Black Sea Fleet is hiding under air defense systems on Crimea, and Ukraine doesn't even have a Navy. So that tells you about the readiness of the Russian Navy. Excuse me. The Air Force has, I don't think there's been a single day since 24 February where the Air Force actually supported ground operations, or there was anything that looked like a joint operation. They failed to achieve air superiority on day one, which should have been the first order of business for them. They didn't do it. I think because, number one, they didn't think they really have to, and number two, this is not, you don't come in a box like that. I mean, you have to practice it. You have to think through what's required to identify and destroy radar and air defense systems and command and control nodes, and then destroy airfields. You know, there's a process that the U.S. Air Force practices on this all the time. They didn't do it. So I'm probably going on too long. I apologize, but these are all manifestations of a military that is not trained and ready. And I don't think they had maybe even half as many bodies as we thought they did, because this is one of the most famous ways to skim money is with ghost soldiers, to claim you've got to pay 100,000 soldiers when actually you only have 50 or 60,000. And finally, I was guilty of gross overestimation of their capability. I'm embarrassed that I thought they would do so much better, and I failed to appreciate the depth of corruption and the effect that would have, and the lack of real operational experience. It was only a thin slice of overall Russian military that was in Crimea, Georgia, Syria, Africa, not much of their military.
Mm-hmm. So, I mean, really, it's fair to say that the Russian military is sort of hollowed out and is just not up to this task.
Right, that's exactly right. And you know, who would have thought 7 months ago that we would be talking about Russia having a manpower issue? I don't trust any number that comes out of the Kremlin. So however many bodies actually are mobilized, they clearly are not people that want to be there, because if they wanted to be there, they would have already been there, right? They would have already volunteered. And so the 500,000 that left, the people that would have been mobilized, 500,000, they're gone, at least for the time being. And so the poor guys who do get mobilized, who show up, will be deployed. And we would say this is criminal to send people to combat that are not trained and properly equipped. It's pathetic what's going to happen to them. And they're going to be showing up not ready to do a task. And so they're being traded for time. That's what I believe. For us, basic training, 10 weeks. That's to take a civilian, turn him into a soldier that knows how to properly put on a uniform, learn how to use a weapon, learn how to do first aid, and then they're ready to go learn how to be an engineer or a tanker or artilleryman.
Liana, looking ahead a little bit, senior defense officials will be gathering in Brussels later this week for a session of the US-led Ukraine Defense Contact Group, which is also known as the Ramstein format. And they'll be talking, among other things, about further military assistance to Kyiv. We've talked a little bit about what Ukraine needs from the West, but what do you expect of this meeting? And can you talk a little bit about what Ukraine does need from the West to support its efforts to defend itself?
I mean, certainly at the meeting, the newest attacks will be discussed and air defense will come up again. We saw that Emmanuel Macron, the French president, has already commented that France will provide more weaponry to Ukraine. And at some point, I do think that the discussion about Europe's contribution as a whole and about Europe's possibility to provide battle tanks to Ukraine will come up again. This has been an initiative or a demand that has been placed in Germany's court, the idea that Germany should lead a European initiative on Leopards, on battle tanks. The United States has signaled in the past that they would not be against Germany delivering those battle tanks to Ukraine. But here we see the kind of typical resistance and waiting game that we've seen on the German side also in the past, to wait until the pressure is too strong, and then to announce further deliveries on Ukraine. From the German side, the delivery of Leopard tanks continues to be framed by by the Chancellor as a step towards escalation, which is not entirely clear how this sort of actually translates to the ground and to the battlefield on the ground, because there are other weaponry like the Panzerhaubitze or the Gepard, without going into much detail, who are already there. So I do think this is not only a debate about the broader debate that we will have in the future. It's not only about the exact weapon systems that we will deliver to Ukraine, but it is about the question of which kind of restraints that the West has imposed on itself will continue to be relevant in the future. And the one restraint that Germany has imposed on itself is the battle tank, the Leopard restraint, but there are also other restraints. The question of US weaponry, is it constrained to 40 kilometers or 70 miles or not? So this point will come up the longer the war continues, and the longer we will see that Russia tries to make up in quantity what it lacks in quality. And this is not only a military discussion, but this will be very much a political discussion. To what extent Europeans especially are afraid of escalation and put this as a top priority in their thinking. Basically being afraid that if Ukraine is too successful, we might see further escalation from the Russian side, or if there is resolve to say, well, if Russia escalates, we need to drop our restraint to deliver to Ukraine what we have not yet delivered. And I think that's the big political discussion for the next week and month.
Yeah, and this is also a big sort of transatlantic debate. Certainly in some of the conversations I've been having with people in Berlin, there's been a sense of wanting to see America take action and for Berlin to follow, rather than for Berlin to take the lead in sending tanks. Liana obviously was talking about some of the constraints that Berlin has placed upon itself. Ben, one of our viewers is curious what the US could do short of direct involvement to help Ukraine achieve a decisive victory. And I guess, as a spin-off to that, wondering, about this question of delivering more military hardware, more serious military hardware than's been delivered up to now.
I heard the Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, last week in Warsaw at the Warsaw Security Forum. I was blown away. She is so impressive. She spoke clearly, firmly about why it was important that we all support Ukraine. She talked about more than 70% of Germans support and doing more for Ukraine. Of course, she's been strong on this from the beginning, but I think now when you've got numbers like that, 74% was the last poll that I saw in Germany. That's enough political support for the government to be able to do more. And
right.
And I sort of understand, but I don't agree with it, that for the government to say, well, the Americans are not giving tanks, why are we getting heat for that? Or how come, the French are not doing much at all comparatively? Why is Germany getting heat? And I can't fully understand it. I know all the reasons, but it doesn't make sense for a great nation like Germany to be so hesitant and so reluctant. And I worry that our most important ally, Germany, if Germany is not seen as contributing significantly to Ukraine's victory, then nobody will respect Germany, including Russia. And that's not good for the United States, because obviously with the European Union being our most important economic partner, not having a strong German ally guiding the European Union with its economic capability, as well as being a leader inside NATO, this is not good for us. And so I think the White House certainly, and to be candid, American taxpayers are looking to see Germany shoulder more of the load. And I don't understand why there's such a disconnect. Now your more specific question is, what else could the United States be doing? Number one, we've got to make sure that American people understand why this is good for us, for Ukraine to win. I mean, unfortunately, there are still Republicans unbelievable to me. The party of Reagan are using Kremlin talking points on Fox News, and even members of Congress, the discredited General Mike Flynn. Unbelievable. But so there are strong voices in America that are vulnerable to Russian influence, and it could begin to degrade our congressional support, which has been so good so far. So we got to make sure that Americans understand why this matters, that this is not just about Ukraine. This is about protecting allies, preventing a broader conflict. And it's also about China, that the Chinese are watching. If we cannot stick together and bear up under some economic pressure now and help defeat Russia, then the Chinese will absolutely not be too impressed with anything that we say about Taiwan or South China Sea.
Liana, would you like to add anything to sort of the domestic debates that we're seeing unfolding both in the US, now that you are based in Washington, but also, of course, in Germany, but also this broader dimension, particularly the China dimension that Ben just brought up?
I think Ben mentioned something which I find very important, and that's the question, how long will the United States and the United States lawmakers, especially after the midterms, the United States citizens, accept that the United States is leading the efforts in the war against Ukraine, and Europeans are leaning into the US leadership. And that's, I mean, looking at the numbers and at the contributions, both financially and militarily, that's the conclusion one has to make. Europe is contributing its part. And I want to say, when it comes to Germany, that Germany is doing meaningful contributions. It's not that there's nothing coming out of Germany, but what is lacking is the leadership. So Europeans feel very comfortable following the US leadership, but they don't feel comfortable, and especially Germany, out of fear of escalation with Russia, doesn't feel comfortable to take the leadership role it should have on the European continent, which is also why we see that Poland and the Baltic states are leaning towards the Nordic states, are leaning towards the UK, because they have the impression that those countries understand the fundamental security threat that they have to this war in Ukraine. Whereas it seems that from a German perspective, escalation management is considered a higher priority and escalation a higher risk than an actual security threat by Russia to Germany itself. And those dynamics at the moment, there's still a very unified approach, but those dynamics will play out in time. And if we look ahead to the US elections in 2024, the questions of burden sharing in this war, and not only about 2% of NATO, but about burden sharing in terms of, are Europeans doing enough and leading the efforts in Ukraine, or are they just doing what has to be done and are following the United States? This can become a bigger discussion. This can become the new 2% discussion in transatlantic burden sharing. And given that the United States is looking towards the Indo-Pacific and China, and that here in Washington, there are obviously discussions about whether the Ukraine war distracts from the real challenge, from the China challenge. This is something that Europeans should be much more aware of than they are right now, and should, ideally take a lead, for instance, in a European Leopard initiative.
We've touched on the nuclear question a little bit in this conversation, and of course, when NATO defense ministers meet later this week, they're also supposed to have a session on nuclear planning. And one of our viewers is especially curious about sort of the US-Russian back and forth when it comes to nuclear weapons. I'd be really interested in hearing from each of you how serious you take Putin's threat to use nuclear weapons. Liana, maybe this time you go first, and then we'll bring Ben in.
I'll go first on this one. I do think we have to take the threat seriously. I don't think it is it is something which is out of Putin's set of instruments that he would use. I do think it is part of the set of instruments that he might consider. But we have to distinguish between the real threat of nuclear use and Putin blackmailing us and threatening us with nuclear use. And I think that's a very fine line to walk, because obviously there's no mathematical way to calculate at which point it is just threats to deter the West from supporting Ukraine, and at which point it can become more serious. But I do think at the moment we are still at a point where Vladimir Putin is basically using this to intimidate the West, where he has many other options available. And if we think about how we can sort of lower the nuclear temperature, I think the right way to think about this is not thinking about what Ukraine can do and what kind of concessions Ukraine can make, but the right way, or the more constructive way to thinking about this, is to think what we can do to deter Russia from actually considering this instrument and considering to use it. And part of that is obviously to have a very clear messaging from the United States and Europe, what kind of an incredible taboo that would be. But part of that is also to try to bring other actors like in India and China on board and get those to message towards Moscow how unacceptable a use would be. So at the moment, I would say it's not to get intimidated by those threats, but still to work towards deterring Vladimir Putin, just thinking about this option.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I agree largely with most everything Liana said. Russia's nuclear weapons are most effective when they don't use them, because once they do use it, then it would be impossible, I think, for the United States not to become directly involved. With China, North Korea, Iran all watching, if Russia were to use a nuclear weapon, a tactical nuclear weapon of some sort, and we did not respond decisively, then I think they would all have learned that you could get away with this nuclear blackmail, that you could wave around a nuke and the U.S. won't do anything about it. And what we have been deterring ourselves for 7 months now or longer, because there was so much concern about Russia, perhaps they might escalate to use a nuclear weapon. So Russia's achieving some degree of deterrence just by the threat of using a nuclear weapon. We haven't provided ATACMS. We haven't provided enough air defense. We haven't provided Abrams and Leopards. I mean, we keep stopping short of providing decisive aid, or even using the words, we want Ukraine to win because of this threat of nuclear escalation. I think it's unlikely that they would ever actually use a nuclear weapon. Not impossible, and obviously I could be proven terribly wrong very quickly, but to use a nuclear weapon, there are zero upsides. There's no positive outcome for Russia in any scenario if they use a nuclear weapon. Tactical nuclear weapon gives them no battlefield advantage. There's nothing, they don't have forces standing by to exploit whatever sort of conditions might have been created by use of a tactical nuclear weapon, which would have been Soviet doctrine in the Cold War. The Ukrainians don't present a big mass target somewhere where they could be destroyed. I mean, they could destroy another city, they could keep doing that, but that's not going to give battlefield advantage, and it's certainly not going to cause Ukraine to surrender or collapse. If the United States, I mean, our president has said that if Russia used a nuclear weapon, that the United States would respond, and it would change the face of the war for Russia. That's what President Biden said. And I am 100% confident that all kinds of messaging has been going to the Kremlin and people around Putin, both from the United States, from allies, from China and India and others, saying, don't make this terrible mistake, because there's no positive outcome for you on the other side of this. And I think that people around Putin who keep him in power realize that, we're taking this very seriously. This is not going to be a red line that they jump over like they did in Syria. This is for real. And that if they have any shred of hope of returning to some sort of normalcy, I'm talking about the oligarchs or people like that, to be able to go back to their apartment in Belgravia or to send their kids to boarding school somewhere in Switzerland. It will never happen if they don't stop Putin from using a nuclear weapon. Now, for tactical nuclear weapons, of course, different from strategic, which can be controlled by a small number of people, the tactical nuclear weapons, there's a lot more involved. The military would have to be involved. These are weapons that have to be taken out of storage, affixed to some a rocket, or used as artillery ammunition, or different ways of delivery. A lot more laborious process. We would be able to detect that as it's happening. And I think that the military is going to be reluctant to be a part of something like that. So the key is making sure that everybody around Putin prevents him from doing this. So that's why I think it's unlikely.
Ben, as you were speaking, one of our viewers submitted a question related to this. He writes, is Germany still a reliable participant in NATO's nuclear deterrent?
Absolutely. Yes. There's no question of that. I think Chancellor Scholz put that to bed, and the German Luftwaffe is going to F-35s. That's a large part of it.
And Liana, yeah.
Just to add on that, I mean, I think it's always important to put sort of the criticism that is directed towards Germany in perspective. Again, it's not that Germany is betraying Ukraine. It's not Germany is betraying the NATO alliance. Germany is doing a good job in this war. But if you the question is, what should be the ambition that Germany has, given its size, given its political and economic power? And there the ambition should be to assume a leadership role and not just doing enough comparable to what everyone else does. And I think this is an important perspective to keep in mind, that there is a lack on leadership, but there are substantial contributions from the German side.
Yeah, the French rank number 11 behind Czech Republic and behind Estonia in terms of the value of what they're providing. But they've been hiding behind Germany, letting Germany take the heat for not doing more. And the French, who like to see themselves as the leading military power in the European Union, that to me is pathetic.
As we think about how this might end, and we've talked a little bit about a Russian way out, one of our viewers asks whether the Vatican could play any role in influencing Putin in a way to try to save lives on both sides. Liana, do you think there's any role for the Vatican to play, or for other outside actors for that matter?
I mean, I don't think there really is at the moment. We've seen at the beginning of this war that the Pope has tried to reach out to the Russian Orthodox Church, but obviously the Russian Orthodox Church has become a function of Russia's political system, which is supporting the war, and the president, the Russian Orthodox Church, has blessed those Russian soldiers who are going into this war as conscripts. And we've seen in the past that the Pope has issued some statements towards an immediate ceasefire, which have been criticized by the Ukrainian side, arguing that a ceasefire does not equal peace for Ukraine. A ceasefire which comes too early would equal occupation and further terror. So I think the sirens of peace that we hear from different corners of the world, from the tech industry, some parts of the tech industry, have to be put in perspective, because again, if Ukraine stops fighting, it does not mean peace for Ukraine, but it means occupation and the end of Ukraine's independence.
Ben, one of our viewers said that on Taga's team, you mentioned that it was a mistake to ignore Putin's speech in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, and asks what we might learn from that.
I don't think I said it was a mistake to ignore it, but I did reference it. I mean, it does get referenced quite a bit. And, that we were perhaps, and I would say that we were perhaps naive, that it was such an outlandish thing that most people were like, come on, he didn't mean that, or can't possibly believe that was the biggest. But in hindsight, you look back and I think he really did. He really did believe it. What's more aggravating is how many people were willing to accept the nonsense statements that came out of the Kremlin about NATO's a threat, it's our fault. You know, all of these kinds of things. There were people willing to accept a Russian narrative, despite decades of evidence to the contrary, of their lack of respect for international law and the notorious way they have of twisting things around, use of force, changing borders, you know, starting with actually Transnistria, Georgia, Crimea and Donbass, and they just keep doing it. And we keep hoping that somehow that they're going to come around and they'll be reasonable and that you can actually negotiate with people like that. And you see what's happened in all the areas that they've occupied here over the last 7 months. I don't know how anybody can seriously consider a negotiation with Vladimir Putin.
So as we think maybe about the longer term, several of our viewers are curious about what sort of the long-term strategy toward Russia can and should be, particularly assuming that there's a time after Putin. And one person raises the question of what the realistic strategic objectives are regarding the eventual outcome of this conflict. And another viewer asks what a stable and sustainable security architecture in Europe can look like. And I think it'd be really interesting to hear from both of you, your thoughts on what does that future look like? Liana, you're nodding, so let me come to you first.
Nodding, it looks like I have all the answers to all these difficult questions. I do think we would love to have definite answers about the future, but I think what we should do is we should think in scenarios of what might happen, and we should accept that there are many unknowns in this game. So we can say right now that we wish that Russia is contained in Europe, that Russia's war fails in Ukraine, and that Russia under Putin or under post-Putin will not continue its imperial ambitions in the neighborhood. But again, given that we've seen with mobilization the destabilization that Vladimir Putin has put on his country, it's very difficult to say how that might unfold. It might be possible that this war will not end on the battlefield, but that it will end with domestic changes and upheaval in Russia. And I think the likelihood for that has increased. So I think the strategic objectives and the limited strategic objectives that we can make at the moment is certainly to contain Russia, to prevent that Russia goes further, to prevent that Russia is able to take over Ukraine, to increase our own resilience, but to think about a European security architecture with Russia in the future is something where there are just too many unknowns to calculate that. What we can say and what we should think about is if we see destabilization in Russia, what will be the consequences of that? And that's a scenario that we should think through. I mean, destabilization can take several turns. It can be a coup d'etat, it can be a civil war in Russia, it can be a transition in power. And those are scenarios that we should at least have some contingency planning for, because the destabilization that it would lead to in Central Asia, in the South Caucasus, is something which will affect our own foreign policy. So again, thinking in scenarios is important, but thinking ahead about what the future European security architecture will look like is something that I would consider almost impossible at the moment.
Thank you, Liana. Ben, any thoughts on the sort of future security architecture in Europe?
Well, I hope that Ukraine eventually becomes a member of the alliance. But we've got to think strategically about the region. And fortunately, Senator Shaheen and Senator Romney have put forth legislation requiring the U.S. government to develop a strategy for the greater Black Sea region. And I think a comprehensive strategy that addresses economic investment as well as military is an important step for all of us that will help improve the security and stability in the region. In the meanwhile, of course, the U.S. is probably going to establish a 3-star headquarters that will be focused on Ukraine. I think it's like Support and Advisory Group Ukraine, that will help with modernization, training, developing of defense institutions, all of those kinds of things. And I think that's going to get underway pretty soon. They'll probably start off in Wiesbaden, co-located with U.S. Army Europe, but eventually move towards either to Poland and or into Ukraine when it's appropriate to do so. So the U.S. is clearly thinking long-term to help Ukraine as well as in the near term.
So Ben, before we went live, you and I were talking very briefly about sort of the level of anxiety in Europe at the moment, particularly in light of these missile attacks, but also in light of attacks on infrastructure or apparent attacks on infrastructure in Europe. I'm thinking here about the 3 explosions on the Nord Stream 1 pipeline 2 weeks ago, 10 days ago, and then over the weekend, an attack on Deutsche Bahn communication lines that really disrupted train travel in Germany. As we come to a close, I'd be really interested in hearing both of you talk a little bit about this level of anxiety, but also how seriously, particularly Germany, is thinking about attacks on infrastructure, and whether these 2 incidents serve as a warning for us to be thinking about sort of an expansion of the current conflict. Ben, this time I saw you nod first, so I'll let you respond first, and then Liana.
All right, so I'll speak as an American living in Frankfurt, Germany. I have been impressed over the last few weeks, maybe month and a half or 2, that there's a hardening or stiffening of resolve among Germans. I don't hear the same angst that I did 3 or 4 months ago. I mean, of course, people are concerned, but here we are in the middle of October, and support for Ukraine, doing more to help Ukraine in Germany is like 74%. I think that people do recognize that this is the last winter that Russia can do this to Europe. People are already kind of preparing themselves psychologically as well as physically for dealing with outages, power outages, increased energy costs. Certainly we are here in our home here in Frankfurt. It's like it's coming, so you kind of prepared for it. And so I think the Kremlin overplayed or played their gas card too soon, so that Germany had the chance to start doing other things to be prepared. And so actually I'm less concerned about fear and anxiety here in Germany and in Europe than I was 2 or 3 months ago. But this, for sure, that's the target for Russians, is to raise that anxiety.
I mean, just to add to that, one has to say that Germany has been quite naive when it came to protecting its critical infrastructure before this war. I mean, the fact that gas storages have been sold to Gazprom, German gas storages, is something which certainly will need a deeper political analysis, and also a discussion in the German parliament how it could get that far. I think the attack on Nord Stream 2, these are not on Nord Stream 2, but sort of on the Nord Stream 1 8B, and I think the Nord Stream 2A pipeline, is something which has woken up Germany to the possibility that its critical infrastructure can also be targeted by Russia in the future. Throughout this war, it has woken up other allies to this possibility, and it has put the question of protecting seabed infrastructure higher on the agenda. This has been a discussion which was not taking place in the public before, but it is certainly something which will be part of the public discussion in the future.
Well, Liana and Ben, I want to thank both of you on behalf of the American Council on Germany, but also the World Affairs Council of Tennessee, for participating in today's discussion. This has been incredibly enlightening for me, and I hope for all of our viewers as well. Unfortunately, I don't think that the war in Ukraine is going to end anytime soon, but that means that we'll have opportunities to continue the conversation about this. And I'd love to have you back in person and via Zoom for more of your analysis and more of your insights. But for today, just a huge thanks to both of you for participating in this discussion.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.